If you are recording and mixing your own music, you want to hear something completely insane. What if I told you that most of the things that you've been learning online, that you've been told online about mixing low end, are actually not helping you? In fact, they're making your mixes worse. This is what we're going to talk about on this podcast episode. We're going to talk about some very common myths around mixing low end and getting the foundation, the base part of your mix right, and why a lot of the information out there is not really helpful. I know where it's coming from, and the people who put out this content and who tell you these rules around low end mixing, they have a point, and I know why they're teaching these things, but in reality, that's not how pros mix records, and it's not really helpful if you just see this as rules. So that's what we're going to talk about today. My name is Benediktine. Hello. Welcome to the podcast. If you are new, hello again. If you are a returning listener, always glad to have you. I've been mixing records and making records full-time for more than 15 years, and I run this platform called the selfrecordingband.com where we do this podcast, but we also help self-recording artists through our coaching inside of our program, the Self-Recording Syndicate. So if you want a personalized, custom, step-by-step plan based on your music, your DAWs, your tools, if you want to know what the next steps are, if you want to get unlimited guidance and feedback from true professionals who are actually making records every single day, go to the selfrecordingband.com/coaching and apply for a coaching spot. It all starts with a free first call. Then we create your custom plan. If you don't like that plan, you pay us nothing and we'll just part ways. And if you like the plan, we're going to implement it together, and you'll be in a spot where you can make really exciting sounding, authentic records that you'll be proud of forever, and you'll be able to do that consistently. So go to the selfrecordingband.com/coaching. We've done it for hundreds of artists worldwide. You can be one of them. And I'd love to see you there on a free first call. All right, to today's topic that I announced. I'm absolutely happy to do this, not alone, but as always, with my fantastic co-host and friend, Manel Espinosa Berenguer. How are you, my friend? Hello.
I'm great. And yeah, guys, just in case you're new to the show, I'm Manel Espinosa, and I'm a mixing engineer and music producer from Spain, always ready to turn your demos into finished songs through a lovely process. And I'm happy to be here to talk about low end today.
Yeah. I'm very interested in your approach or your thoughts on this in general, because I don't see you as someone who is just following strict rules and numbers when it comes to mixing. You are very much vibe and feel based. And, you can absolutely learn techniques and approaches and follow rules, obviously. But in many cases, there are no hard rules. And you are a lot about the song, the emotion, the impact, the vibe. And mixing is just a tool to enhance that, to bring that out. So it's not really mixing by numbers when it comes to low end. It is doing whatever makes the song feel best and whatever makes the low end feel the way it's supposed to feel. So I'm very interested in hearing your thoughts. So the thing with these rules is that on paper and in theory, the whole mixing by numbers approach seems to make sense, right? So this is why so many content creators in the audio world are promoting and teaching versions of this. And there are actually some concepts and ideas that we can all take and add to our arsenal, as long as we apply them intentionally to fix problems, not as a general way of mixing low end, not as a rule that you always have to do, right? So it is not how, and like these rules or these approaches are not how professional engineers actually make records. It's not how we get the low end to feel right, and feel being the key word here. The thing is, I think that when people, and we said it on last week's episode, when people primarily make content, they need frameworks and approaches to teach, because that's what gets people to view videos and that's what gets people to engage. And it's kind of helpful to get an idea across. The problem is that people take these as rules and as things you need to do instead of just another tool that you can use if the situation calls for it. That is kind of the problem. So I'm not even saying that all of these people are wrong. It's just that anyone who actually makes records all day, they will be hesitant to say that this is how you mix low end, because there's no one way to do that. And there's not even we don't do this by numbers, is what I'm saying. And we don't just have this one secret or this one approach. But I get why content creators do it. And it gets you somewhere. It gets you closer, at least, than not knowing anything at all. So there's a time and place for these things. But let's dive into these, what the problem is with those and what to do instead. Before we get into the actual myths that I want to talk about and some approaches and stuff, maybe Manel, I don't know if you have general thoughts to share on this topic and how you approach it. I would really love to hear if you ever, when you mix a song, if you ever even think about, so now I'm gonna make the low end work, or if there's like, how do you approach this? Is this just part of the entire mix? Is there a certain process you follow, a certain way you think about it? Let me know.
First of all, I think I rarely think about the low end as a separate thing. I tend to think about the song in general. But about what you mentioned with content creators making, content related to these things, I think one problem is that, first of all, there's a tendency to simplify things because between some other reasons, nowadays we have a really fast consuming platforms, and sometimes we don't have that much time to explain things. So if you only have 3 minutes, sometimes you don't have enough time to explain the context properly. And it can happen that maybe some of these guys making the content, they know that what they are explaining cannot really be applied to every single situation, but they don't have time to explain that. Or maybe it could be the case where, for example, if you spend your whole time mixing pop rock songs, you can have a trick to control the low end or something that works for you every time, but you should be aware that that doesn't work for every single kind of music or every single song. But maybe for your particular case and the way you work, it works most of the time. So yeah, but it's very difficult to communicate those things properly because you would need to take way more time to explain the context.
Yes.
So
that's the thing. Context matters so much, and it's all about the song. And one song might not need anything. Maybe the low end is perfectly fine the way it is if you just balance things out and do nothing to it. And maybe it needs 15 different surgical moves to make it work. It's like context is really everything. But I think from what you're saying, I get the feeling that what matters is how it feels and how it sounds and the song overall, and not, first of all, not just the isolated low end, and then also not like there's not you don't have this. I didn't hear you talk about any numbers yet, like a certain hertz or a certain thing you have to do or whatever. It's just, it's not mixing by numbers, it's mixing by feel and and reacting to what comes out of the speakers and that kind of thing, right?
Yeah, mostly the only thing that the only moment where I have some numbers into account is that when I do the balancing at the very beginning of the mixing process, I open the view meter, and normally the kick takes around -5, kick plus bass it's around -3, and then kick plus bass plus vocals is around 0. That's the only thing that I normally go for, those numbers or close to those numbers,
Awesome. Yeah, totally. No, that makes sense. And gain structure is one of those technical fundamental things that we just need to know in general. That's just basic engineering. So you're totally right to do that, but that is just having healthy levels everywhere, leaving enough headroom. But it's not like, it's not just low end specific. It's a general thing, but it applies to low end because low end has the most amount of energy, and so you need to, in the beginning of the mix, make sure you give yourself enough room to do all those things. So yeah, that makes sense. Okay, cool. Let's dive into some of these specific things. I'm gonna say the 5 myths that I want to talk about. I want to say them first, and then we get to the solutions, to approaches that I think are more helpful than just hard rules, and then to examples of how you can deal with things in certain situations. And I think if you have a good understanding of what it actually means to get the low end right and what problems could potentially come up, you'll have an easier time getting the low end right. And it's more helpful than saying, always do this based on this number, this hertz, this whatever technique. But like understanding what's actually going on and why you might need to do some of these things is like very helpful, I think. So we're going to get to that. Okay, let's start with those myths and rules or whatever you want to call it. The first one. If the kick drum fundamental is, for example, at 60 hertz, cut the bass at 60 or filter out everything below 60. There can only be one. This is something a lot of people share often, where they say, you have to cut the low end in the bass wherever the kick takes over because you can't have both down there. Myth number 2, the bass needs to be above the kick or below the kick. You have to make a decision. It's another thing that people say a lot. The third one, high pass everything except for kick and bass. Or maybe even including kick and bass, but this whole high pass everything or low cut everything, get rid of like rumble on everything down there. Myth number 4, below 100 hertz, there can only be kick and bass. So everything else is like supposed to only live above that. And in the subs, basically, there can be no energy except for kick and bass. Myth number 5, you have to make space for the kick and bass, so you need to carve out certain frequencies in each of them. If you don't, they will be masking each other. So this whole theory that you have to somehow make pockets, create space, and carve out frequencies in either the kick or the bass or both for them to be able to live together down there happily. So there's a little bit of truth to all of these, and I know where those are coming from, but they are definitely wrong if you state them as absolute truths or rules. So before I get to these individual problems that are, or these myths, and then solutions for those and explanations, I want to start with a general solution and truth, which is an actual truth, and that is something that's overlooked a lot, and that is it all starts at the source. As always, we always say this when in all kinds of contexts, but it's always true. So people always think about when it comes to low end, people always immediately think mixing. It's all a mixing task. It is not. It is actually much easier to mix a song if you think about some of these things while you are building the song, while you're recording it, while you're even writing it or building the arrangement. The key to a great sounding low end is to be intentional about things like drum choice, drum tuning, or if it's virtual drums, sample choice, the tuning of the samples, phase, like when there's multiple samples together or multiple mics on a drum kit together. Phase is really important. In some genres, even the phase relationship between bass and kick, if it's always the same, if it's electronic music, very important. Instrument choice, the type of bass you're playing. Is it a 5-string? Is it a 4-string? Is it a precision, a jazz bass, or some other thing? Like it has a different kind of low end. String choice. The type of material you choose. Does it have a lot of bright mid-range that can make the instrument audible, or is it a very dull, dark sound? How consistent is the low end? And like all those things, string choice matters a lot. Then Manel's favorite topic, the key of the song. Yeah. Of course, like it affects all of those things. Or whether you play the lowest octave or an octave up on the bass and stuff like that, different type of low end. Yeah. What the bass actually plays, how many notes. How does that play along with the kick drum pattern? Is it in between? Is it happening together? Is it, whatever is going on down there? The kick drum patterns, like I said, again, what do the drums actually play? What does the kick play? What does the bass play? How does it all go together? The arrangement and the content of all the other instruments, because context matters, and your mid-range and your top end in the mix have an impact on how your low end feels and how much low end you can have overall. So it's all context. It's about the entire song. It's not about the isolated low end. There needs to be contrast and like a balance between all those elements, sort of. So all these things matter. And I don't know if you think strategically about the low end, Manel, when you produce a song, like when you build the arrangement, when you write something, when you choose the instruments, or if it's just natural to you to make certain decisions, but it definitely affects it all. And whether or not it's going to be easy to mix that depends on some of those decisions that you make right there.
I like to have an idea of, for example, where's the fundamental on the kick, and especially on the kick and the snare. and to at least kind of know where the bass exactly is gonna sit depending on what I play. But I don't have like a really like analytical thinking when I'm doing that. I like to have a general idea, and if a problem comes up, then I'll find a way to fix it, right? But I'm more based on my feelings and how it feels and if it sounds good or not. Another thing that I think that is also important, especially when playing the bass, or at least that's what I'm thinking right now, is the performance. Because it's not gonna sound like the low end. It's not gonna sound the same if you play the bass right super on time with the kick, or if you play it slightly later, which is what I normally like to do. And of course, it always plays an important role the way you edit that, because if you can later on edit the bass and place the notes slightly later, and that's gonna affect how the transients on the kick drum feel and everything. So that's also important.
Huge part. Thank you for bringing that up. It's the performance, the timing. And when we say a little later, we don't mean obvious mistakes or sloppy playing. Like, I know that every time we say something like this, people will use it as an excuse, or they will say, you see, I told you we don't have to be accurate. They are saying it doesn't need to be in time. No, that's not what we're saying. It needs to be in time, but we're talking a tiny bit later. Still on time, but like a little bit, like not obviously off. So that's distracting.
And still, you should be able to be consistently slightly later, not just sometimes.
Not random. It's not random. That's the thing.
So
yeah,
that's difficult.
That's difficult. Yeah. So that's always something I say, where like, if you are not that experienced and if you're honest to yourself and you're like, I'm not the best player, I haven't been playing for like 20 years at a professional level, it might be best to start practicing to be really spot on first. And once you can do that, then you can intentionally drift and add more, variation and all that. But it's the same with the click. If someone is struggling to play to a click, before you try and play with the click and add feel to it, I would first make sure you can actually play tight on the click. And once you master that, then you can intentionally move things around. So, but yeah, that is one thing. The other thing when it comes to performance or the source is also the tuning. If a bass is slightly out of tune, it's funny how it might still sound okay and not really off, but then when you try and like be a little more accurate with the tuning and record a bass that's really spot on when it comes to tuning, or you correct it later if you have to, you'll notice that the whole low end just feels better. You didn't change anything about the EQ, you didn't change anything about the compression. It's just that the notes are right, and it might be a subtle difference, but for some reason it locks in better, or for obvious reasons, it locks in better with the low end of the other instruments. It just feels better. It's just less distracting, and for some reason the whole low end just feels more consistent, feels better if it's just a little more spot on versus being slightly out of tune. So those things really, really, really matter. What you just said, Manel, about the bass being slightly late, for example, intentionally, or playing with that relationship in terms of timing and performance, this is actually a perfect segue into what I wanted to say next, is this general concept that in a mix, it's all about balance in all kinds of different ways. So volume balances, frequency balances, panning left and right, stereo image balances. At the end of the day, it's all some sort of balance that you're trying to achieve. Doesn't mean everything, balance doesn't mean equal. It means the right balance, which can mean that something is crazy loud and another thing is crazy quiet, but the right balance for the part. So mixing is always about finding the right balances for things. It's about contrast a lot. So in terms of when it comes to low end, the contrast between the low end and the top end or the mid range and how those things interact. And then it's about relative amounts of energy, which means that low end instruments create a certain amount of energy together. They create a certain amount of energy on their own, but when they're happening together, it builds up, it adds up, and you get more low-end energy in general. And you need to balance that amount of energy against the energy that you get from the presence of the guitars and the presence of the vocals, for example. It's all about these relative amounts of energy in a mix. And one mix that has very harsh, aggressive, bright, guitars and like screaming vocals, that mix can take a lot of low-end energy as well to balance that out. But if you have a very smooth jazz song with not a lot of presence and everything's kind of dull and round, you won't be able to get that same massive amount of low end in there, because relative to the rest of the mix, it's going to sound completely out of place. And so it's always about relative amounts of energy. And why does this matter with the timing thing that you just said? So it can, like I said, low-end instruments create a certain amount of energy together. And this can be totally fine, or it can be too much as soon as they play at the same time. And in that case, we have a couple of options. So it might be that your bass guitar on its own, balanced against what the guitars are doing, the vocals are doing, everything else, it's just perfect the way it is. You hear all the fundamental notes. It sits nicely there. It provides the foundation for the song. Everything's nice. But then every time the kick hits, or maybe there's another low-end instrument in there or whatever, every time that comes in, the bass is still fine, but the overall amount of low-end energy just gets too much for a little moment there. And it's what can cause the limiter in your mastering to distort, or it can cause just an out of balance sensation. Every time the kick comes in, it just feels too dull or overpowering the rest. But then if you turn the kick drum down, it's not loud enough, and you can't seem to find the sweet spot. It's either too loud and overpowering, or it's kind of disappearing. Or it might cause certain playback systems to respond weirdly. So car hi-fis, car stereo systems, for example, they tend to have a low-end boost and to make things sound fuller and nicer. And if you have moments of overall too much low-end energy, it might mean that the car stereo starts to distort, or it gets boomy, the car doors start to rattle, whatever. And so you need to control the overall amount of low-end energy. And so when that happens, you have a couple of options. You can deal with that through multiband compression. You can keep the overall energy amount in the ballpark with that. So let's say everything sounds awesome, but every time the kick drum hits and it adds up with the bass, it creates this burst of energy, and it's just a little too much. So what you can do is you can put a low, like a multi-band compressor, only the low band of that, on your mix bus, for example. And so every time the overall low-end energy gets too much, the compressor, only in the low band, turns that down and keeps it under control. So when there's just the bass guitar, the compressor does nothing. But when the kick hits, it holds it down. So it reduces both of those things, and it's the overall amount stays the same. This is one approach. Just normal compression can do that. If you just compress your drums and bass together, for example, or you have a mix bus compressor, a normal mix bus compressor, that will do some of that, because low end has the most energy. And if the energy gets too much, the compressor reacts and it just turns the entire mix down a little bit. It moves with the amount of low end. So it keeps things in check. Very simple tools, especially just the standard compression, sometimes do the trick. You don't have to do crazy sidechain stuff in most cases. But then you can, of course, do things like sidechaining, preferably a certain frequency range, not the entire thing, where if you really want to go fancy, you can pick the frequency range where the kick drum hits, where the fundamental of the kick is, where it has the most energy. You can pick that range on the bass guitar, and then only every single time the kick hits, it just turns down the bass in that area to just keep the overall amount the same. Different ways of dealing with that. None of these things is something you always have to do, but these are different approaches that you can deal with this. And now to the timing thing. If you do what Manel said, and you are able to play with a little bit of an offset, or you edit it the way that the bass is slightly later, you might not get that problem at all, because maybe the burst, the biggest burst of low-end energy comes from when the kick hits first, when the transient of the kick happens, but that is gone pretty quickly. And if your bass transient is not happening exactly at the same time, but a couple milliseconds later, you might get a slightly longer feel of that bass note or that bass transient, but the amount of energy where it adds up is lower, because you have the kick transient first, right after that the bass transient, so it's just a longer transient, but it's not a much louder transient. And so that way, those bursts of energy are a little reduced already, and they might just live perfectly well together. This is why this approach can sometimes make a song feel really great. First of all, the longer transient gives it a little bit of a laid-back, kind of relaxed, groovy feel, and not like less tight in a good way. And then also, things don't add up as much compared to when you have both transients exactly on top of each other. You get a much bigger level increase compared to when they are slightly apart. So this is how performance can impact how the low end feels, and it's all like with all of these things. It's really about how low end instruments add up and how they create these moments of more energy, and how you balance this overall low end energy against the rest of the song, and whether or not that feels good. And in many cases, it's not even a problem that there is more energy when the kick hits. In many cases, it's fine. It's just fine. For a short moment, you have 60 Bs more low end. So, like, if that works and nothing distorts and it sounds great, let it rip. Let it be like that. So. Yeah. Is there another reason for, or like the whole timing thing? Is that like, what do you notice when you do that? How, in terms of how the low end feels different? Is that pretty much what I just described, or do you notice something else too?
No, that's the main thing. I mean, I do that mostly because of the feel more than thinking about the low end. But at the same time, it also helps with what you just said.
Cool. And then also you can use that to your advantage the other way around. If you, for example, have a big part where the first hit of this chorus or whatever needs to have the maximum amount of impact, and like, you know, it might help to make sure that this first hit is like super tight, and you want to make sure that all the guitars, the bass, and the drum transients are exactly on top of each other, because when that happens, it's just the biggest amount of volume and energy you can get in that moment, and that might be what the song or the impact of that part needs. In other cases, it's the exact opposite. Maybe it feels really great if the impact is a little more sloppy and like more, you know, you drag it out a little bit, can also feel great, but be intentional with those things. And sometimes people think, you know, they wonder why the part doesn't feel as big, and then they try all kinds of different mixing techniques, when in reality, all of it can be fixed by being intentional with how the transient comes in, how things are adding up or not adding up, and how all those energies from different instruments go together and create the impact in the low end. Yeah.
Yeah, and that, I mean, now that you mentioned that, you can also play with what part of the bass are you playing your notes, because you can use the higher strings where it tends to sound more bright, or you can use the low string when it sounds more like fuller, I would say, normally darker. So you can create also that contrast in the low end if, for example, on the verse you play the same notes but using the like higher strings, and when the chorus comes or any moment where you want more low end impact, then you go to the low string.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Big thing. I sometimes have this when artists think to add another level of power or whatever, or to give the chorus a lift, they sometimes go up on the bass in the chorus, and then it has the opposite effect, and all of a sudden the chorus feels smaller. Like I had that a couple of times when I mixed songs, and I noticed, damn, like I know why they're doing it, but it's not actually helping them. They played the entire verse in the lowest string, and then in the chorus, instead of the low E, they play the 7th fret on the A string, you know, and it's like, yeah, I get the idea, but all the foundation is gone in the chorus, and I want this to be bigger. Can we not reverse this, you know? Or, yeah. So, totally makes a difference. Now, to those statements above that I said. The first one.
Mm-hmm.
If the kick drum fundamental is at 60 hertz, cut the bass at 60 hertz, or filter out everything below 60. There can only be one. So, first of all, again, it always helps to know what actually is going on. Filtering out the low end on a bass guitar with a low-cut filter or high-pass filter, it's two different words for the same thing. Filtering out the low end means you're getting rid of the lowest octave or parts of the lowest octave. Which means every note that you can play on a bass has a fundamental frequency. And if you double that frequency, you get an octave of that. So an example that most people would know, most musicians maybe, hopefully, is like 440 hertz is an A. Half of that, like 220, is also an A. 110 is also an A. 55 hertz is also an A. So if 55 hertz is an A, below the A, you still have lots of notes on most bass guitars, right? It goes down to an E with standard tuning, or even lower with 5 strings and other things. So if you cut everything below 60 hertz, for example, the A and everything below that, you'll get rid of that. And then, the B, the C above the A still has their fundamental frequencies, maybe, And so you're creating a disbalance a little bit. You're removing some fundamental frequencies, you're leaving in others. Depending on where you filter, you might get rid of the entire lowest octave. And this is not always a problem. As always, you have to be intentional with this. You just need to know that you're doing this. If you get rid of those fundamental frequencies, all that's left is the first octave and then all the other overtones above that. There's something fascinating that our brain does that is called the missing fundamental effect, that even if we do that, based on the overtone structure that is left, our brain is able to add back the missing fundamental, and we kind of hear it, although it's not there. So it can sometimes still work to filter that out, and it still somehow is present in the mix, psychoacoustic effect. But you're getting rid of it. There's less low end down there, and you got to know what you're doing. And in many cases in modern music where we are used to hearing a full low end. It's not like, in the 70s and 80s, that stuff was not as important. We had a lot of things was running through actual cabs, like speakers with microphones in front of it. They would have a low end roll off. There was not much subs going on anyways. But these days, we hear a lot of electronic bass elements. We hear a lot of DI bass guitars. We're just used to hearing a low end that goes down all the way to 20, 30 hertz in a controlled way. And so you got to be really intentional if like whether or not you want to actually get rid of that stuff, if you want to have the weight and the size that we can now reproduce with modern systems, or if you want to limit yourself to something that used to be a limitation when we only had tape and vinyl and other, recording gear. So be intentional about that. There's no need to do that as a rule. Not at all. There's plenty of really great productions where the bass guitar goes down all the way to 20, 30, whatever the lowest fundamental is of the notes that are being played in the song. And there's still somehow a kick that lives together with the bass, and it works. So absolutely not a hard rule. Can it work in certain situations? Yes, but you're making the bass smaller, you're making it narrow, you're giving the low end less weight, and you're not using the full potential that you have available in the low end. So just be intentional, know what your song needs, know your vibe, your style, what you're going for, have a sound in your head, and be aware of what you're actually doing. So this affects the musical content of your song, not just the low end energy. It's actually removing musical content based on the key of the song. So one important concept maybe here is the different ways that that low end overall can feel. And the best way that I have found to describe this is anything that is like really, really, really low and subby on most systems or headphones, anything that actually can reproduce this. That stuff to me always feels big and kind of soft and pillowy and not as firm. It always feels a little longer and a little... you can't really grab it. It's not as tight. It's like this feel more than something you can hear. It's like the weight. It feels longer, softer, sort of. Whereas everything, from 80 and above, around 100, 150, the upper bass range, that to me feels more like something I can grab in front of me. That's like more tight. That's more narrow. It's more precisely defined. It's not as long. It's not as soft and pillowy. It's a little more punchy. That's how I think about these ranges. So if I want a very tight, well-defined, mid-rangey bass where it's not really long and resonating in the low end, it's very firm, tight, smaller intentionally, very controlled, then I might want to get rid of the low stuff because of that feeling. But if I want something that provides a bed of like massive low end that just feels big and makes this, creates a lot of depth, and it feels a little loose and softer and slower down there, just heavier, then I want to keep the subs. Those are kinds of the two characteristics that I always, give to low end. This will help us with all the other concepts that we're about to share. I don't know, do you have different ways of describing or thinking about low end, or do you even perceive it the same way? Maybe for you, it's completely different. Everyone has a different way of hearing.
Yeah, I think I'm really close in that regard. But I like to mention also that even if you decide to high pass the bass or whatever, it also it's also important the way you do that. Right?
Oh yeah,
because like our friend Slatin, who we had here in the podcast, I'm not sure if he mentioned that on the episode or I've seen him saying that on his social media. But anyways, he talks about the fact that it is not the same if you do a super stiff, like high pass,
yeah.
or if it's more like gradual. Because like making it super stiff can bring you way more problems than doing it gradual. So even if you do that, also take that into account. I don't know exactly what problems that causes because I don't remember, but
yeah, but you'll know when you do it and you'll hear it, and that's how you make your decisions. But yeah, I can tell real quick, like the most obvious things are if you use a steeper filter, first of all, you create more distortion. Every EQ band creates distortion. The distortion just means a change in sound, and it means distorting the frequency response. And if you filter out with a steep filter, it's going to have side effects to frequencies outside of what you're actually affecting with the filter. So slightly above that, you're going to get distortion in the low end. It definitely changes the phase. So if you have multiple mics on, or combining a DI and an amp, for example, on a bass, and you filter one of them and you use a steep filter, you're going to put them out of phase. Not necessarily 180 degrees polarity flip, but it's not going to be the same phase relationship anymore. And if you use a linear phase filter, you don't have that, but then you get pre-ringing, which is a very weird artifact where you can hear the signal slightly before it actually happens. So there's always a different downside to filters. Normal filters, when it's not linear phase, they have post-ringing, so it's not the pre-ringing, but it adds a resonance slightly after the transient. So the steeper the filter, the bigger this resonance gets, and then you get a little bit of a ring at the frequency where the filter sets in. So these are just some of the common downsides, and the more gentle the filter is, the more transparent it gets. The steeper it is, the more you get these artifacts. In the low end feels different. And then also, of course, a gentle roll-off leaves some of the notes still intact. It doesn't cut them out entirely. It just turns them down gradually as you go towards the low end, whereas a steep filter cuts it much more drastically. So with the 60 hertz example, you might still have a little bit of the A there at 55, but maybe the G and the F are almost completely done, they're turned down. Whereas with a gentle filter, you still get plenty of the G and the F, and then it starts to reduce, the energy. It's like, be intentional, as always. And gradual filters are much more musical in general, and steeper filters are more for like surgical control of things, and, very careful with that. But you're totally right. It definitely matters. Okay, so the next one. The bass needs to be above the kick or below the kick. You have to make a decision. That's one of my favorite ones. I teach a similar thing, but it's not a hard rule for me. And here's the difference. So the bass can absolutely be above and below the kick. It doesn't have to be only above or below the kick. There's nothing wrong with it being everywhere in the low end. But here's how you can interpret this advice and make it useful. Every low end instrument, and if you take the example of a bass guitar, will have both of those areas. They will have the low end, the subs, the very, very low end, and they will have the upper bass part of it. Depending on how it's recorded, it will have more of one or more of the other. And depending on what you want it to sound like in your mix, you're going to focus more on one or the other. It doesn't mean to get rid of the other, but you focus on where you want it to have the most energy. So, example, if you record a bass guitar through a cab, an actual speaker with an amp and a speaker. That speaker, especially if it's like a classic, closed cab, like an MPAC 8x10, one of the most recorded or the most recorded bass cabinet. It was not ported. It doesn't have extended low end. It doesn't have a resonant frequency there. It just gradually declines towards the low end. It cannot reproduce 30 hertz. It just, at least not well, it just rolls off naturally in the low end because that's what the speaker can reproduce. The smaller the speaker, the more drastic that roll off. If it has ports, it might be extended. If it's closed, it's not extended. But every speaker will have a natural roll off. So if you record bass like that without a DI, you're naturally going to have less of the sub 60, sub 50 kind of stuff. You're going to have way more around 100. And by default, you're shaping your bass sound to be that upper bass, tight, punchy, growly. It feels subby and deep, but it's actually not that subby. But you automatically have kind of more energy there, which means if you want to fill in your mix below that to make use of all the room you have there, you can now choose a kick drum that has a ton of subs because the bass naturally is not going to go down there. Or you can now add a synth below the actual bass to fill that in, or you can use some sort of processing like an octaver or something to add that, or you can just leave it and be happy with the fact that there's not that much energy down there. But by making this recording decision, you've already decided that you focus more on the upper part of the frequency spectrum of the low end, and so the bass will be quote unquote above the kick, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't have anything below that. It's just less than what you have at around 100, and the stuff can still be there. You don't have to filter that out. The other way around, if you record a DI, you can have all the low end in the world, all the way down to 20 hertz if you want to. And if you use a low-tuned bass or 5-string or whatever, you're going to have a ton of like 30, 40, whatever, if you want that, because there's not that roll-off of the cab, and maybe it's a different instrument and tuning. Now you can make a decision, and you don't have to decide if the bass is below the kick or above, but now you can say, I like the weight and the feel that I'm getting from those sub notes on the bass, and I like the fact that my subs are sustained notes from the bass guitar. I don't want to get rid of that. Now, do I want to focus on that? And if so, can I also have the upper bass punch, or does that take away from that feeling that I want down there? So you can make a decision of like, if I reduce the upper bass, I'm shifting the attention more towards the subs, which gives me more of that feeling, or I can just leave them there as a baseline weight, sort of, and still feature the 100 more. So it's not like either or. It's like how you balance out those things. Do you shift the attention more towards the subs, or do you shift it more towards the upper bass? And then how do you fit your bass drum in there? Or do you even have to think about how to fit it in there? Because maybe the bass drum just works the way it is, and you don't have to do anything with that. But maybe you can also make an intentional decision and say, okay, if I have a bass that's focused more on the subs and the soft, pillowy, big stuff, maybe I can now have a kick drum that is more tight and punchy. And if I tune that a little higher, if I make the kick a little shorter, if I compress it hard so that it has a lot of punch and it's short and tight, then I don't add additional boomy sub information to my already subby bass, and I get a cleaner, more balanced low end overall. This is kind of the thought process, but again, it's not about getting rid one of the other or clear either or. There can be a kick at like 60 hertz, and then there can be sub information below that from the lowest bass notes, and then there can be bass information above that from the growl and the tight low end of the bass, and it can perfectly work. It's like building a puzzle intentionally, and that there is no such rule. That what happens if you do that, if you always think, okay, I either got to cut all the upper bass and the bass is only subs, and my kick has to be higher up, or I need to have a subby kick and then cut out all the subs of my bass. If you always do that, you get a very clean, separated low end, yes, but it's going to feel unglued, and you're going to leave a lot of potential energy and feel on the table. You're going to get rid of stuff without a necessity for that. It might work, and it might feel separated and clean, but it also will feel smaller compared to other mixes. It won't have the depth, and you're leaving a lot on the table. You're missing potential down there to make the song very big and to glue the kick and bass together and to get the overall amount of energy that you want. This is what you're doing when you have the strict above or below kind of mindset. It gives people these exciting results quickly because you think, oh, now I can finally hear my bass and the kick, and it seems to be the right thing to do. But then when you compare it to your references, you realize that your low end always feels smaller and it doesn't have the impact and the depth. And this is because most people don't do drastic surgical decisions like that. They reduce it a little bit. They shift the amount of attention down or up a little bit, but they're not getting rid of it entirely. Yeah, so it's about what I always call the boom and the knock. The boom is down there, the knock is like a little above that. And I bet, Manel, if you're doing pop songs or pop rock or more something that's not like super heavy maybe, and you're dealing with electronic samples or whatever, it's almost inevitable that you're going to have sub information in a bass and also a kick sample or something. It's like everything is in the low end. It's that I bet you don't have that strict decision that your kick can only live at 80 hertz and the bass can only be below that or something,
No, never. And I mean, sometimes they even are very close or maybe in the same frequencies, and nothing happens.
Yeah.
Like nothing bad happens. So
that can actually feel very, very, very good and super massive if you intentionally make them add up instead of separating them. Think about one of the most iconic kind of low end types and feels sort of to me is when the new metal era came up in the late 90s, or Limp Bizkit, that kind of stuff. If you listen to what would be a good example song, let me think about an example. If you listen to "Rollin'," for example, like a big hit from Limp Bizkit, listen to that low end. How good that feels, and both the kick and the bass are living in the same kind of low end frequency ballpark. There's not a ton of subs going on. It's all like more of the upper bass. It's really full. They're completely colliding and crashing there, and still you can hear both. And together they create this massive feeling low end that actually doesn't measure as massive. Like it's not that like in terms of numbers, it's not a huge amount of energy going on there, but it feels like it, and it just works. Nobody sat down there and said, oh, but like if the kick is here, we have to put the bass then below, whatever. No, they just let it rip together. They like every time the kick hits, it adds more energy to the low end. The two together create this massive feeling, groovy thing. And if you would separate the two, it would completely unglue the low end and destroy the entire groove of the song. So you can absolutely intentionally have them live in the same range. It's all about knowing what you're doing and being intentional with those decisions. And then you have the more modern productions where people really build this puzzle to maximize the amount of low end you can have overall and to maximize the amount of loudness you can have. If that's your goal, you can do that. Like if you listen to modern metal productions, if you listen to things like Architects or whatever, you find, or Bring Me the Horizon, that kind of mixing style, you'll find sometimes that the low end all the way from like 30 or so to like 100 is completely full. It's maxed out. It's just everything has been used, and so there will be sub synths and the bass guitar and the kick, and it's this even absolutely maxed out low end. So they put everything they can into that, into what's possible low end wise, so that you get this massive, big sounding result. But that's not what you have to do. This is one approach. You can be as surgical as you want about this. You can be very groovy and loose about this. The next one, we covered this on the last episode also, where everyone says like, no, that's not what you should do. It's like high pass everything except kick and bass maybe. You answered that with a clear no, Manel. You gave it a very low rating on the last episode. So I get that you don't high pass everything.
No, but I have to say that I used to do that, like because I probably saw one of those videos of someone saying that, and I would do that. And the fact is that if you don't do it, nothing happens normally. Yeah. So
good things can happen if you don't do it. Actually,
the thing is to evade doing things just for the sake of doing it or as a rule or something that you always have to do. Sometimes, for example, when using synthesizers, you might have some parts where you can hear a lot of super low end and maybe you don't want that, maybe you don't need it and you can just cut it out, but it has to be a decision based on what you hear, not on some certain like predefined rule or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say, like you said, if there's a problem, deal with it and cut it. If there's no problem, leave it alone. Be intentional and aware of these things and of any important musical information that you're removing. Again, like you might cut out a note, a fundamental of a note that's actually important, and then your balance between the notes is completely out of whack. So, and then another thing that I had to learn, because I used to do that thing again, like you did. I used to do that thing a lot in the past, where I just cut everything because I thought, well, if there's nothing useful down there, I might just get rid of all the what I call rumble or whatever. And now I only do it if it's really a problem, because size and depth can really suffer from cutting lows too much. On guitars, for example, if you go and listen to electric guitars that you recorded, and like you'll find that below a certain frequency, you don't hear the music anymore. You'll only hear rumble and noise. And in many cases, or in some cases, it can be the right thing to remove that, because if it just adds extra energy to the low end that you could use, and if you remove it, you can use more energy from the bass or the kick or whatever. That can be a good thing. Maybe the guitars don't add anything useful down there, and you just free up more space for other things that are more important. So in some cases, it can work. But sometimes, especially in moments in the mix where the guitars are on their own, you might have to automate this, or you don't want to do it at all, because even if you remove rumble and not really musical information, that kind of rumble can give you the sensation of an amp moving air, and like the depth and size that you get, the massive kind of feeling when you stand in front of a guitar amp. If you remove that stuff down there, the core content stays the same, but also it gets a lot tighter and thinner, and it's just not as massive anymore. It's something you can feel more than you can hear. So if you decide to cut lows, if there's a spot where that instrument is on its own, maybe try and automate the filter and see if it sounds bigger when the low end is in there, and then you can turn it on again when other stuff comes in. And maybe it doesn't even matter, because it only adds to the overall energy a little bit. And even if you can't tell a difference, then don't filter it. If you can't tell a difference, leave it in there, because when in doubt, leave that extra energy there. It might glue it together better with the bass. If it's not a problem, leave it alone. If it clearly gets better when you filter it, then filter it. But if it's not a problem, leave it there, because every bit of depth and size and content down there that you can get that is not taking away from the other stuff is just extra weight, extra size, extra depth that you can get for free, basically. And so just do that. And it's something that's very hard to describe, but if you overdo the filtering on an entire mix, again, things can sound very tight and very cleaned up. But it's also, in those cases, when you A/B with a professional mix, you're sometimes like, yeah, it kind of sounds the same, but also smaller and more two-dimensional, and it doesn't excite me as much emotionally. I'm not moving to it as much, and that can be a result of over-filtering out that kind of size and for lack of a better term down there, and the groove that's in there. A lot of the emotion is also in the low end and how it interacts with us, and yeah. So be intentional, is like Manel said, is what you need to do. It's much better to control low end and build up, and think in terms of energy amounts, like I said. So, for example, if you have guitars and you feel like they're too boomy and they have too much low end, instead of going in and filtering them out in a steep, aggressive way and getting rid of everything that you think is boomy, maybe just, again, use a multiband compressor on those guitars and only turn it down in the moments where it actually gets too much. This is a very common technique in heavy music, where you put a multiband compressor and you let one band of it, let it focus on the area where the fundamentals of the guitar are, and then every single time when there are jugs and it like the low end builds up from those palm mutes and those jugs, the compressor turns it down and avoids an overly heavy buildup. And when the guitar just plays open chords, it just leaves it alone, and you keep all the size. Instead of doing a static EQ move or filtering it, that would maybe get the jugs under control, but then everything else will sound thin. And so doing that dynamically, only in the parts where the buildup gets too much, and thinking about it in terms of overall energy amounts and controlling the buildups, is much more useful than thinking about removing certain frequencies in general. Same thing for the next point here, which is like the 100 hertz, everything below 100 hertz. I heard this number a couple of times. I don't even know where it comes from, but some people say like below 100, there can only be kick and bass. That doesn't make sense to me at all for many reasons, because below 100 can be all kinds of things. Low-tuned guitars have their fundamentals below 100 for sure. Even standard tuning, depending on what you play, like there's stuff down there, and low-tuned guitars definitely. A piano, if you play a very low piano note, it absolutely has information down there below 100. Strings, synth, there can be so much stuff down there. Again, it's about overall energy, controlling buildups, and it's all relative to what's going on in the mid-range and the top end. So yeah, I don't even want to say more about this. It's just like that can definitely be more below 100 than just kick and bass.
Yeah. Just
or do you filter out from a piano or whatever always everything below 100?
No, as always, it depends.
Yeah.
Maybe sometimes that's a good choice, but I don't know. I just there's no absolutes in here.
Yeah. And automation is something that I think is also overlooked. So in a very dense arrangement, if let's say you have a metal song but also orchestra in the same song, and or a rock song and also pianos and synth or whatever, maybe for denser sections of the song, you might have to roll off some of the low end on all the instruments just to avoid it overall becoming too much down there. But then there might be a quieter section where the heavy guitars go away or there's no drums and it's just this interlude and there's only the piano left or the strings. And in that case, you would have to automate it and bring back the low end on those instruments in that section and then turn it back down again when it gets more dense. So it can absolutely be dynamic and changing from part to part. It's always about overall amounts of energy, and then relative to the other instruments, everything might have to step back a little bit and be a little thinner. But when there's less going on, every individual thing can have more, so yeah. Okay.
And
yeah, go ahead.
Just a little question that I'm thinking about when you mentioned the thing about the compressors, like what's the difference between dynamic EQ and a compressor?
Yeah, it's a good question. So a multiband compressor turns things down. With a multiband compressor, you have a crossover frequency left and right of the band that you're addressing, And so there's a filter at the top and a filter at the bottom. And between the low end and the mid range, for example, you'll have two filters, one high cut, one low cut. Together they create the crossover. And then those bands act like simple compressors that only are active in that frequency range that you allow, basically, with those crossovers. And you have attack and release and threshold, and it's just a compressor, but it is bandwidth limited, sort of. And with an dynamic EQ, you have filter curves where you have a Q shape, the steepness of the filter. It can be a notch, it can be a broad bell, it can be a shelf, it can be whatever. Like it's filter curves with all their side effects and distortion or linear phase or not, or all these things. Different steepness, different Qs. And those curves are only active when the signal gets past a certain threshold. So it's not a crossover and then in between everything gets turned down. It's a shape of a band with all the characteristics of an EQ that only gets active when the signal exceeds a certain threshold. So they're very similar, but one is activating an actual EQ that is moving, and the other one is just compressing a range that's defined by a crossover. That's how I would say it. And then in terms of features, some dynamic EQs have attack and release and kind of behave like compressors in the way that you control them. But some of them are very simple, and you really have a basic threshold or even just an auto feature and not really attack and release and all these things. Whereas the multiband usually has the normal compression behaviors. Also with a dynamic EQ, you don't have a ratio. You just say that turn it down up to 10 dBs or up to 5 dBs, and then it will gradually get closer to that. But you set the maximum sort of, whereas a compressor has a ratio and compresses a certain amount relative to the input signal.
Yeah.
The effect they have on the signal is very similar, but you can be more surgical with a dynamic EQ, and you can be more broad overall controlling and more transparent with a compressor, with a multiband compressor, I think.
Yeah.
More detailed in terms of how the compressor reacts. So that's what I mean with transparent, because if I say I can have a precise attack and release and I can set a ratio and it's just to me, that's the more broad, musical, and slightly more transparent approach. I'm not saying you can't be transparent with dynamic EQs, but that's kind of how I think about it. And with a dynamic EQ, I would fix a very specific problem, like a certain bass note being louder than other bass notes. With a dynamic EQ, I can go in and narrow in on that fundamental of that bass note, and every time it plays, it turns it down. Whereas with a compressor, I might have to create a very, very narrow band, and then I might catch other things too, and it won't be as precise. And then with the dynamic EQ, you can also boost, of course, which is not the case with all dynamic compressors. You can also say, make it louder and not quieter.
Yeah.
The next one is, the final one is, you have to make space for kick and bass. So you need to carve out certain frequencies in each of them. If you don't, they will be masking each other. I say the masking is nothing you need to be afraid of. This is something that people always think about so much, that frequencies are clashing and you need to carve out space and all that. And yes, sometimes that's true, but things are clashing all the time. If you bring vocals and guitars together, both of them will cover all the mid-range. You can make a little more space, and you should in many cases create some pockets, but you can absolutely accept the fact and just live with it happily that things are clashing. And same is true for low end. So you don't have to be afraid of it by principle. It's just when it creates a problem that you need to do something about it. It's very rare actually for a kick to disappear because of the bass or vice versa, especially if you choose your sounds and instruments intentionally and what you're playing makes sense. So unless the balances are completely out of control or out of whack, and unless you chose something that doesn't play together well or sounds super similar, it's very unlikely that it's going to be disappearing. And you can make a kick more audible easily by just shaping its mid-range. If you just add more beater attack to it and you change nothing about the low end, all of a sudden the kick becomes audible no matter what you do in the low end. If you can bring out a bass by adding more mid-range and bringing out the growl and character of it, or enhancing the pick attack or the finger sounds without doing anything to the low end. You can compress it really hard and give it lots of punch, and all of a sudden the kick becomes more audible, because before it was dynamic and the quieter hits were like drowned out and the louder hits you could hear them but they were not really punchy. Now if you compress it really heavily and maybe saturate it, all of a sudden every single kick hit is punching through and it becomes really audible, and you didn't change anything about the low end really other than shaping it with the compression. You can shape the transients. You could add more attack with the transient designer, or you can soften it. You can make a kick shorter, and then it allows you to turn it up louder because you don't get the long ring in the low end. All kinds of things. So you don't have to be afraid of things masking each other as long as you know how to shape them so they become audible. And yeah. And also with shaping the bass low end, like I said, if you go through an amp and cab or a virtual one, you automatically roll off the subs. You can turn the bass up louder, and now you get more upper bass growl and a tighter sound. Or you can use a DI, use it all the way down to 30 or 20, and now it feels more pillowy and soft, and you can do those things intentionally to fill in wherever there is space and make things more audible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know, like I'm not sure to what extent does it make sense to talk about the low end only, because like if we talk about the low end, we need to be aware that the low end is not something special that lives alone in there, It's like the bass always has also mid-range, the kick also has mid-range, and even like high frequencies and stuff. So like in my brain, it doesn't really make that much sense to talk about the low end individually and carving things there just as if there was no other thing, right? Because as you just said, right? If you want the kick to be audible, maybe it's not about the low end. Maybe you can just boost 8K or whatever. So yeah.
Yes, we absolutely need to talk about it in that way. And also, sometimes you don't even do anything to the signal itself that you want to make more audible. So maybe you leave the kick as it is, but you cut 4 to 5K in the guitars, and all of a sudden the beater attack becomes audible because it was being masked by the guitars. And it was another low-end problem. It was not even a kick problem. It was something else in the upper mid-range that made it inaudible. Or maybe the bass is perfectly loud enough, but it feels like it's drowned out. Because maybe there is so much going on in the mid-range that your character of the bass there, the growl or the distortion or the finger sounds or whatever you want to enhance, that they're completely masked by something else. And as soon as you free up the bass in the mid-range, all of a sudden it becomes audible, and all of a sudden you also seem to hear the low end better because you connect it to this other element that you can now hear. So it definitely, everything affects everything, and the low end is not an isolated thing. It needs to be balanced against the rest of the mix. It's overall amounts of energy, like we said, and sometimes the problem is not in the low end, although you think it is there. Like 100%. Definitely. And in so many cases, it's just a simple volume problem. Sometimes it's really just turn the bass down 1 dB, and all of a sudden it works with the kick drum, or turn it down 3 dB or whatever. It always starts with like careful balancing. And being really intentional and paying and like taking enough time to balance properly the volume balances also tells you pretty quickly what you need to do EQ-wise, because if you take the time to really, turn down all your faders and you bring them up and you try hard to find a perfect volume spot for everything in your mix. As soon as you can't do that with something, as soon as you bring up the bass and you're like, okay, here I start to hear it, but it's immediately too loud. So if I turn it down, it disappears. I can't seem to find a spot where it just sits right. If that's happening, that tells you that there is a problem you need to fix. And then you can go and look like, okay, what are the characteristics of the bass that I would want to hear? Is it the character in the mid-range? Is it my distortion that I'm missing? Is it actually the low end? What else is going on in my mix where I could make space? And now if I do that exercise again, I can find a spot where I can actually hear the bass without it being too loud. And, so being super intentional and taking the time to do proper balancing will give you a lot of info on things that already work and you don't touch them, and on things that don't work because no matter what you do, you can't find a good balance for them. Or maybe you find a good balance in one spot, but then in the next part it falls apart. That means it's maybe too inconsistent, or you need to automate more, or you need to compress more. But yeah, it's all about the context, and it's sometimes just simple volume moves as well. So yeah, and you can always make a decision where each of those things is more important, especially in the low end, without having to do a lot of frequency carving. It's mostly done at the source anyway, like we said. Picking the right sounds is half the battle, at least more than that. Because if you pick the right sounds, if you just balance them out, it will work. Like if you combine a low-tuned rock kick drum, like a 22-inch rock kick drum that's tuned where the fundamental is around 50, 60 hertz, which is very normal for a rock kick, and then you combine that with a bass guitar that's recorded through an MPEG amp and cab, those two, just faders up, will work together because by nature, you'll have a strong fundamental at 50, 60, you'll have a dominant bass at around 100, you can balance them out, both will be audible, you'll be happy. And then you'll have a kick attack at like whatever, 3, 4K, and you have 800 hertz bass growl, and they just work without doing anything. And so, it starts at the source. And then you can enhance it with just musical boosts and EQ moves and compression, saturation, all those things, right? And don't be afraid to do the same, do boosts at the same frequency, for example. If you think that it sounds cool to boost the kick at 60 and also boost the bass at 60, do that. Like, there's nothing that says you can't do this just because the numbers might look weird based on what you heard on the internet. Absolutely. So, yeah. I'd say, first of all, do less of everything. Focus on picking the right sounds to begin with, arranging and playing the song so that it makes sense, then balancing it really carefully, and then start with very musical, broad strokes, and only then go to like surgical, more refined, fancy techniques and stuff, because you'll find that in most cases, if you do the first 3 things that I mentioned here correctly, you'll be absolutely fine. In many mixes that I work on, I balance it out. I might do a little bit of a shelf on the bass overall because I don't want to mess with the internal balance of the instrument. I just say all of the low end up a little bit or all of the low end down a little bit. That might be it. In many cases, I don't do a lot of carving on the bass. I sometimes use a multiband to control overall amount of low end, and I find a good volume balance, and that's all I do for the low end. In many mixes, that's all I do. Maybe I boost the fundamental of the kick a little bit or get rid of a honky frequency or something, but in terms of making the two work together, I don't spend a ton of time dealing with that. I just make my bass sound cool, decide how much low end overall I want. I make my kick drum sound cool, decide how much I want from both of those compared to the rest of the mix. And if I get a nasty buildup, I do something to control that dynamically. And I'm a happy mixer.
Yep.
And then maybe there needs something to be said about having an unbalanced, unruly, wild kind of low end too, because it sounds like it can easily, we're talking about balance and energy a lot, can sound like you're supposed to make things very controlled and consistent always. And while I like a consistent low end because it translates well to all kinds of different systems, and there's lots of advantages to having consistent low end, sometimes having a wild, out of control low end can be really cool for an individual part or an entire song. If it's just something that sounds a little, it's like, oh wow, that's too much, but I'm so glad that it's too much. That, I don't know. It's, as you said, it depends.
Yeah. I have nothing to add about that. It depends. That's the right answer.
Yeah. And so again, I know that polarizing content works and all of that, and like it would be easy for me to say those people have no idea what they're talking about and stuff. But no, I know where they're coming from. So if you're a content creator and you made a video on that kind of stuff, I know why you do that. I know that all of these techniques and approaches and things there's a reason for them, and I know that you mean well, but the reality is nobody mixes like that. We mix based on what comes out of the speakers and how we react to the song, and we don't mix by numbers, and there's no hard rules. And it might give you a quick win, and it might be better than not knowing at all what you need to do, but the sooner you realize that these are just tools that you use to fix problems, and that it's just about how it feels, and that you can do whatever you think sounds cool as long as you're aware of what is actually going on in the low end, yeah, the better you'll be off. So
Yeah, so basically, I think the phrase would be don't fix problems before actually finding the problems.
yeah, yeah, exactly.
Because that can create new problems.
Yeah. Don't fix problems you don't actually have, basically. So yeah. Totally. Okay, so next time you see a rule on low-end mixing or a video on that topic, question it, and don't question the person immediately, because they might, know what they're doing, or they might have a good reason for it. But question the assumption that this is how you mix low end, and save it in your brain and in your arsenal as something you could potentially do. But always make a decision like, what's going on? What do I actually remove here? Why do I control this? What am I trying to achieve? What do I want this to feel and sound? And does this actually help me with this? And in many, many ways, many cases, you'll find that it's very rare that you need to use those techniques and approaches or rules. And it's just a big, big advice buffet where you can pick and choose different things based on your situation in front of you. All right. So that's another episode in the books. Wow, 305 episodes. Man, I'm pretty excited about that. It's a lot.
Do you remember episode 1?
I don't know the order, but I'm not 100% sure. I think the first one was, can you actually make a DIY record or something like that? I think we talked about whether or not that's possible. And then the other, we started with 3. One of that was the, can you make a DIY record? I think. Maybe people are looking that up right now and I'm wrong, but I think one of them was that. And then the other 2 was Malcolm and I sharing our backstories, sort of.
Right.
Yeah.
Long time ago,
yeah. We've covered a lot of things since then. Yeah. So I'm looking forward to next week. Thank you so much for listening once again. If you want to see and hear how all these things work in your mix, like if you don't know, if you're still unsure like what applies to your song, or if you need someone to show you based on your material, basically, if you want to do that and based on the tools that you have and the EQs, the compressors and all the stuff that you have available, or if you want help picking the right sounds, getting feedback on whether or not that works naturally, what a better source tone would be, or any of the stuff we talked about today, go to theselfrecordingband.com/coaching and apply for coaching. What we're doing is not another generic video course. It's not just a theory-based tutorial that you then have to make a decision if it works for you or not. We actually tell you what we think what we would do to your music, and we give you clear next steps. We give you feedback, and we answer all of your questions, so you never have to worry and wonder again and do a bunch of trial and error. So the selfrecordingband.com/coaching is where you want to go for this. And if you want someone to create a beautiful low end for you through a lovely process, go check out Manel's website or just DM him on Instagram. He's a great producer, and he will do those things for you, so you don't even have to worry about it, other than like writing your lyrics, singing, and creating a great song together with him. All right. Thank you for listening, and see you next week. Bye.
Goodbye.